Okay, today we are going to talk about the various policies used by the government at macro level. Uh, Now, before we start that, we already know that government in macroeconomics, it aims to achieve the following objectives like full employment level, low and stable inflation, balance of payment equilibrium, steady economic growth, avoidance of exchange rate fluctuations, and sustainable economic development. And in order to achieve these objectives, the government uses fiscal, monetary, and supply side policies. Let's talk about fiscal policy. What is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is a policy which a government adopts in order to change the aggregate demand of the economy. Now, fiscal policy is used by the government, and in this fiscal policy, government changes its taxes and government spending in order to influence the aggregate demand and achieve various economic objectives. Now, fiscal policy is of two types: reflationary or expansionary fiscal policy, in which the objective of the government is used to increase the aggregate demand, and in order to increase the aggregate demand, government is going to start cutting the tax rates so that people have more disposable income. And if people will have more disposable income, then quite natural they will demand more, aggregate demand will go up. And the other way is the government will the government will increase its spending by increasing the spending on infrastructure and so many other things. The jobs will be available. If jobs will be available, income will increase, AD will increase. On the other hand, you have deflationary or contractionary fiscal policy. The objective of the government is to reduce the aggregate demand. Under this policy, the government will increase the taxes, and when taxes increase, people have to pay more taxes, so they will be having less disposable income to spend, thus AD will reduce. Similarly, the government will reduce its spending. By spending less, people will have less disposable income, and therefore they will spend less, AD will reduce. Now, there is something called discretionary fiscal policy. Discretionary fiscal policy is some deliberate changes done by the government in its spending and taxes. That is known as discretionary fiscal policy. But one is automatic stabilizers, where the government is not deliberately changing its spending or taxes. Okay, and that is known as automatic stabilizers. For example, during recession, government spends on unemployment benefit automatically. And this is something which government does automatically. It's not a deliberate action by the government. Okay, and similarly, tax revenue from corporate tax, income tax, and indirect taxes will fall automatically as profits, income, and expenditures decline during recession. So during recession, the government's tax revenue falls and government spending increases without any deliberate action of the government, and this is known as automatic stabilizer. But when the government deliberately changes the spending and taxes, it is known as discretionary fiscal policy. Then we come to what is known as budget. So budget is basically a statement which every government prepares at the end of every year, mentioning down what is the plan for spending and what is the plan and how much tax revenue it is expecting in future. So budget surplus means when the government plans to get more revenue from taxes as compared to its spending. Deficit is when the government spending exceeds the tax revenue. Balanced budget is when spending matches the tax revenue. There are two terms, cyclical deficit and structural deficit, when we talk about government budget. So when the government budget occurs due to changes in economic activity, it is known as cyclical deficit. Okay, and in this case, the government is unlikely to be concerned. Okay, because as soon as the economic activity improves, the deficit will automatically be corrected. The other one is structural deficit, and this deficit, government is much more concerned. Okay, and uh, in order to remove this deficit, the government has to take necessary steps, and this deficit arises when the government is committed to too much spending as compared to its tax revenue. The next type of policy is the monetary policy. Under monetary policy, there are three instruments used by the government in order to influence the aggregate demand. So remember, fiscal policy and monetary policy both influence the aggregate demand of the economy. So under monetary policy, the government uses interest rate, money supply and exchange rate to influence the aggregate demand. So let's study each of this. Now monetary policy is again of two types, expansionary and contractionary. Under expansionary monetary policy, the government aims to increase the aggregate demand. And how does it aims to do so? The government will reduce the interest rates. If the government reduces the interest rate, cost of borrowing will reduce. People will hence borrow more. If they will borrow more, they will spend more and AD will increase. Second instrument uses money supply. The government will increase the money supply or print more money. So money supply will increase. If money supply increases, people will have more money, so they will spend more and ED will increase. The third is reduction in foreign exchange rate. If the exchange rate of the country goes down, the currency will become cheaper and hence the domestic goods will become cheaper. So exports will become cheaper and imports will become expensive. So if exports become cheaper, demand for those goods will increase, and if demand for our goods increase, the AD will increase. On the other hand, contractionary monetary policy aims to decrease the aggregate demand. It does so by increasing the interest rate. If interest rate increases, quite natural, cost of borrowing will increase, people will borrow less and AD will reduce. Other ways to reduce the money supply in the economy, and the third one is to increase the foreign exchange rate. If foreign exchange rate increases, goods will become expensive, so exports will become expensive. If exports become expensive, then demand for exports will reduce and this will reduce the aggregate demand. The third type of policy adopted by the government is the supply side policy. Under the supply side policy, the government main objective is to increase the aggregate supply. So there are the various ways in which it increases the aggregate supply. The main objective under this type of policy is to improve the overall productivity, which will increase the aggregate supply in the economy. And in order to increase the productivity of the people, the government spends on education, training. Okay, so this will improve the productivity and increase aggregate supply. Apart from this, the government may adopt measures like cutting the corporation tax, cutting income tax, reducing welfare payments, spending on infrastructure, trade union reforms, privatization. Privatization means selling the loss-making government firms to the private sector so that it becomes much more efficient and aggregate supply increases. Deregulation meaning removing rules and regulations which were imposed by the government, which will encourage producers to increase the aggregate supply, and providing subsidies to the firms, which will reduce the cost of production and increase the supply. So let's study each of them in detail. So if the government cuts the corporation taxes, the firms will be encouraged to invest, and when investments will increase, this will increase the aggregate demand as well as aggregate supply. Similarly, cutting down income taxes, this will encourage workers to increase their working hours because now they have to pay less taxes to the government. This will persuade them to stay and work for longer hours, and this will increase the productivity and aggregate supply. A reduction in welfare payments. If the government does not spend on unemployment benefits, then people will look for jobs. This will increase employment and hence aggregate supply will increase. Spending on education will increase the productivity and skill set of the people, and hence productivity will increase, aggregate supply will increase. Trade union reforms may also increase workers' flexibility and cut down on the number of days lost due to strikes, which will increase the aggregate supply. Increase spending on infrastructure. This will reduce the transportation cost. If transportation cost reduces, cost of production reduces and aggregate supply increases. Privatization is when the inefficient government firms are sold to the private sector. Due to privatization, the firms operate much more efficiently and aggregate supply will increase. Deregulation, when the government deregulates the market by removing lots of rules and regulations, then this increases this reduces the cost of production for the firms, and the firms will increase the supply. Similarly, if government provides subsidies, cost of production reduces for the firms and supply will increase. Going further ahead, let's study or talk about policies which are adopted by the government to correct balance of payment disequilibrium. There are two types of policies. One is expenditure switching and one is expenditure dampening. Under expenditure switching, the objective of the government is to persuade the consumers to switch from imports to domestic production. So when this happens, the imports will reduce as the demand for domestic goods will increase, and this will also increase the exports. The second type of policy adopted by the government is expenditure dampening policy. As the name suggests, the objective of the government is to reduce the spend of the consumers. So consumers are persuaded to spend less. When the consumers spend less, the imports will fall, demand for the domestic goods will also fall. Since people are not buying the domestic goods within the country, producers will sell the domestic goods in international market, and hence exports will rise. So through expenditure dampening policy, government tries to reduce the imports and increase the exports. So in both the ways, exports are increasing and imports are reducing, which will improve the balance of payment situation in the country. Let's study expenditure switching policy in much more detail. Now, expenditure switching policy, as explained earlier, in this policy, the government aims to persuade the consumers to buy more of the domestic goods rather than foreign goods. So, people are tempted to switch from imports to domestic goods. So, this will lead to a fall in import expenditure and increase in the demand for domestic goods. So if the import expenditure falls, then the country currency, the supply of country's currency abroad will go down, okay, and this will lead to an upward pressure on the exchange rate. Similarly, due to expenditure switching policy, people are tempted to persuade to domestic goods. So demand for domestic goods will increase, and this will also lead to increase in export earnings. And if export earnings will increase, then the demand for domestic currency will increase in international market, which will lead to an upward pressure on the exchange rate. Similarly, we have the dampening or reducing policy, where the objective of the government is to reduce the overall spend, and one is that people will be persuaded to buy fewer goods from abroad, okay, and they will also be persuaded to buy less from domestic producers as well. So due to which producers will start selling abroad and it will increase the sales abroad. This will cause a fall in imports and rise in exports.